Hello and welcome to the Reorg, where we dive into the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute archives and re-examine old ideas after years of accumulated proof of work. This is your host, Michael Goldstein, also known as Bitstein, and joining me as always is my co-host, Pierre Rochard. Pierre, welcome.
Thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm very excited about today's. I know I'm excited about every episode we do, but I think this is a very special one. We've been making our way through the S&I mempool crash course in Bitcoin political economy. So these are the articles written mostly 2013 through 2015, kind of laying out our vision of what Bitcoin is, where it would go, and why it would, ultimately take over as the global reserve currency and beat out fiat and precious metal currencies in the process. And, we've covered a lot of ground and a number of articles that people would know about. But I think today we're getting to one that I would put it in the sort of triumvirate of great articles from the mempool. I think the three that people think of most are today's Speculative Attack, and two others we'll be doing soon, Hyperbitcoinization and Everyone's a Scammer. And so this is the one, this is your contribution. So after we've discussed kind of all of the lay of the land of why Bitcoin's fundamentals are so great and why, for instance, they will allow Bitcoin to grow even despite all of the, naysaying and worries about image or volatility and so on and so forth. You come with this idea of speculative attacks, saying that as Bitcoin will grow, it'll actually start not just competing with other currencies in the sense of just being a better currency, so people start to adopt it, but that there's also going to be some economic activity that is a little more on the offensive, so to speak, which would accelerate the whole process. So this was an article written on July 4th, 2014. The price was about $630. And I thought it would be good to start with sort of a background on this article, which I would say, of all the things that you've accomplished in Bitcoin, and you've kind of dipped your toes and done quite a lot in so many different facets of Bitcoin, from education to development to mining to the Lightning Network, product development, all sorts of things. I do think that this article ends up standing out as one of the most notable sort of entries into the sort of Bitcoin ecosystem and mindshare, if you will. So if you could just start, what motivated this article?
So first I'll start by agreeing that I peaked 10 years ago, and, I'm like the quarterback who almost won the game in high school. No, but so this was based on another article that came out in 2013, March 13th, I believe, 2013, from a gentleman who I believe he's an attorney and somehow ended up writing something called Regulating Digital Currencies, Bringing Bitcoin Within the Reach of the IMF. So keep in mind, this is 2013. And basically, he made the point that there could be speculative attacks by Bitcoin users on fiat currencies, and that the IMF is ill-equipped to handle the widespread use of digital currencies. I think that had a lot of foresight. When I actually read his explanation of the mechanics of a speculative attack, I didn't think that it was, or at least it didn't map to what my understanding of what a speculative attack is, which was based on reading about what George Soros did with the British pound in the 90s and what Paul Krugman wrote about. And it's very ironic to me that the term speculative attack was popularized by Paul Krugman, who is a well-known Bitcoin critic. I would put critic in air quotes, though, because if you go back and read Paul Krugman in 2011 in the New York Times, his argument for why Bitcoin was going to fail was because its value was going to increase too quickly. And so whether you, the reader, came away from that article with, oh, I should not buy Bitcoin because it's going to fail because the price is going to go up, or you concluded that, in fact, you should buy Bitcoin, and even if it fails, it doesn't matter because its price will have gone up. But it was just back to that perspective that, oh, you can't have a stable currency if, its price goes up. In any case, I was very motivated to write Speculative Attack because I thought that the piece that was written about the IMF was kind of just focused on the IMF's perspective and I don't think it was hostile towards Bitcoin, but it didn't have a pro-Bitcoin perspective to it, which I definitely wanted to get out in the world. And then it also gets to the question of, well, two questions. One is, what gives Bitcoin a competitive advantage in the marketplace? Is it the payments or is it the monetary policy? But by what percentage does each contribute to Bitcoin's competitive advantage? The other question is, what's the end game? How does Bitcoin actually go from being some weird niche magic internet money to actually being the next world reserve currency? And that to me, the answer was speculative attacks. And so that's why I decided to write this in the summer of 2014.
Yeah. And as we'll see, I think that there was incredible foresight. There's a few things I look forward to hearing how you might see it now. But I do think this is one of those articles that has aged like fine wine, because at the time you were speculating about speculative attacks, whereas today, we can say that there are a lot more places where we actually see speculative attacks in process, and many in a very large way. So I think that's why this one has held up. I think it was interesting to a lot of people for a long time, but in recent times, in the past handful of years, it's gained importance or sort of prominence because it's actually gonna happen. So let's go ahead and get started. Introduction. And I guess I will say there are a handful of footnotes and such, and I'm going to try to read them kind of in line, because I think the footnotes that actually are not just links
references
to something. Yeah. Those obviously I'm going to skip over, but the other ones, I think they are worth reading in line. They're just sort of parenthetical. I don't know what the professional audiobook way of reading through stuff like that is, but we're gonna try anyway. So, introduction. Bitcoin naysayers wring their hands over how Bitcoin can't go mainstream. They gleefully worry that Bitcoin will not make it across the innovation chasm. And he's on naysayers, a footnote. No, seriously, there are people on the internet spending a non-trivial amount of time writing about a currency they think is going to fail, yet continues to succeed beyond anyone's expectations. I get schadenfreude from their lack of schadenfreude. Granted, a few of them are being paid to write controversial clickbait and or just concern trolling, both activities that I respect and understand. And a lot of and then you list the different kinds of concerns that people have. Things like, it's too complicated. It doesn't have the right governance structure. The security is too hard to get right. Existing and upcoming fiat payment systems are or will be superior. It's too volatile. The government will ban it. It won't scale. In our government structure, you say, this is generally stated by people who are in the out group and fantasize about being in the in group through politics and pedigree rather than economic and meritocratic processes. Demographically, they probably overlap with fans of The Secret. Economically, they are without exception Bezzlers. And can you quickly explain that term?
Bezzlers are just it's an abbreviation of the term embezzlement, and so they are people who are not exactly aligned with economic reality and are finding ways to cheat the system.
Great. So continuing on, the response from the Bitcoin community is to either endlessly argue over the above points. And footnote on this, Bitcoin has entered its eternal September, where every person new to Bitcoin thinks they have a unique understanding of Bitcoin, and everyone ought to hear about it. There's an endless flood of newbies concerned about such and such problem with Bitcoin. The Bitcoin community does these Aravistes a real disservice by taking them seriously instead of just telling them, read more. So, they argue above those points or to find their inner Bitcoin Jonah with platitudes in Bitcoin Jonah. The opposite of Bitcoin Jesus. Bitcoin Jonah is a defeatist, self-sabotaging, and timid, quote, man who is on a permanent quest to confirm Bitcoin's weaknesses. And this is also what, can you explain the Jonah complex that this is referring to?
Wow, this has been a while. I don't think I could accurately give it a.
Okay, I'll jump in with the very TLDR, which is that the Jonah complex is a fear of your own success.
Yeah.
And I can't totally connect that back to the story of Jonah and the whale exactly off the cuff at this moment, but that's actually all you need to know about what that's
worth a follow-up though. Maybe we'll do a podcast on Jonah.
Yeah, this is actually, well, we'll do that another time. It was actually referenced in another article, I think that we already read, but I do think that that's a important concept, maybe even worth its own kind of investigation. So they find their inner, so they argue with the above points or find their inner Bitcoin Jonah with platitudes like, Bitcoin, the currency, doesn't matter. It's the blockchain technology that matters. Or, it would be better if the blockchain technology were used by banks and governments. Or, Bitcoin should continue to be a niche system for the bit curious. It's just an experiment. Or, Fiat and Bitcoin will live side by side, happily ever after. Or, Bitcoin is the MySpace of, quote, virtual currency. The above sophisms are each worth their own article, if just to analyze the psychosocial archetypes of the relevant parrots. A few of the criticisms mentioned earlier are correct, yet they are complete non sequiturs. Bitcoin will not be eagerly adopted by the mainstream. It will be forced upon them. Forced, as in, quote, compelled by economic reality. People will be forced to pay with Bitcoins, not because of the, quote, the technology, but because no one will accept their worthless fiat for payments. Contrary to popular belief, good money drives out bad. This, quote, driving out has started as a small fiat bleed. It will rapidly escalate into class 4 hemorrhaging due to speculative attacks on weak fiat currencies. The end result will be hyperbitcoinization, i.e., your money is no good here. People might not believe it, but I think you were even punchier in the past than you are today. For people who have really been around, I think you on Twitter and circa, around this time, you were an expert at wielding the knife in Twitter knife fights. And I think it's an interesting introduction because you're basically saying that this is, everyone's wanting to imagine, Bitcoin is this thing that's going to grow because everyone happily enters Bitcoin. But you're suggesting then instead that Bitcoin is something that's happening outside of the individual's control because there's a whole network of people engaging in these economic activities that have outsized effects on the growth of the money. And so many people are, when we talk about mass adoption, it's not necessarily that you're going to go and, get every man on the street to look at, all of the details of Bitcoin and go read the Bitcoin standard and all of that. And they're going to come to the conclusion, oh, I should start using that. But rather that Bitcoin as a macro force is going to happen such that all of those people are just going to have to start using Bitcoin.
Yeah, and I think that on some level, it does make libertarians uncomfortable. The thought that, oh, it's not my individual choice, and the other thought of there's actually decisions that are made by others where it has to affect my entrepreneurial economic calculation, and so that's easy for us to accept when we're talking about the purchase of a phone, right? We can say, oh, okay, I have to get an iPhone because I don't want to have a green bubble, when I'm chatting with people. And we're okay with being forced into that economic reality. But when it comes to money, it's like, okay, so the same principle applies, and that it's not as voluntary as some would imagine it to be. You have to accept it. Today we have to accept using the dollar. And so if you're like a strong libertarian, you might even go like, oh, okay, well, I'm not allowed to use the roads. I'm not allowed to use dollars, to reductio ad absurdum. So conversely, with Bitcoin, it's not this idea that, and this is something I saw back then quite a lot, which is people were trying to figure out, okay, how do we develop like the killer app that will really drive Bitcoin mainstream? And, we need to increase the utility and the ease of use and we need to change Bitcoin to adapt it to the outside world. When what I saw and what I continue to see is that the outside world actually has to radically adapt itself to Bitcoin.
Yeah, that's an interesting point with libertarianism. I can certainly understand, why it makes people uncomfortable. And I would also say it's like, even with your example, you still have people who they don't care about the green bubble in the text message. So they decide that they still want to use Android, or specifically, even some spin-off of Android that has, many more features that appeal to their, desires for privacy and so on and so forth, which, completely makes sense. So there are still options, and yet they're not getting to choose like a totally different mode of cellular communication in many ways. Like they're still using the same cell networks. And so, other examples of these sorts of phenomena would be things like language, where, you are completely free to go start your own language. But doing so is going to put you at an extreme disadvantage. No one will have any reason to adopt your language, and it's only going to make your life rather miserable to do so. And so money is like that, where you are kind of at the whim of, whatever the dominant economic forces are. And even the people who try to get on zero with Bitcoin, as they say, the goal there is to minimize the time spent holding a cash balance of dollars. But even for most of those people, I don't think a lot of them are actually using Bitcoin to pay for all of their expenses. So they're able to minimize that time holding, but they are still dependent on the dollar network insofar as there is a global economy that has the dollar as its most liquid medium of exchange. And that's just sort of a reality that we have to deal with. And Bitcoin gives us a hope because it based on all the stuff that we've talked about on this podcast and elsewhere ad infinitum, is that Bitcoin has what we think has what it takes to overcome those network effects and replace it with something that actually is superior. And there's reason then, if you believe that, to want to start adopting it now, rather than being that person who just goes to the store one day and realizes that people no longer want, their continentals or in the future, their dollars.
Yep.
So continuing on, Thiers' law, good money drives out bad. And this starts an extended quote from an economist, Robert Mundell, which I believe he's a Nobel Prize winner. Is that correct?
Yeah, actually, he's a brilliant monetary economist, even though he's not like fully Austrian.
Yeah, and I think is he from Colombia or was from Colombia?
Oh, that I can speak to.
So this is a long quote from Robert Mundell from a paper of his called Uses and Abuses of Gresham's Law in the History of Money. So, quote, historically, it has been good, strong currencies that have driven out bad, weak currencies. Over the span of several millennia, strong currencies have dominated and driven out weak in international competition. The Persian Derek.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. I wasn't around back then.
It's also one of those things, it's you just read things. It's like that's why I can't pronounce like German phrases that I read all the time. But so I'll just abuse it. This will be uses and abuses of the English language.
Right.
The Persian derrick, the Greek tetradrachma, the Macedonian stater, and the Roman denarius did not become dominant currencies of the ancient world because they were, quote, bad or, quote, weak. The florins, ducats, and sequins of the Italian city-states did not become the, quote, dollars of the Middle Ages because they were bad coins. They were among the best coins ever made. The pound sterling in the 19th century and the dollar in the 20th century did not become the dominant currencies of their time because they were weak. Consistency, stability, and high quality have been the attributes of great currencies that have won the competition for use as international money. And then this is now Pierre. Bitcoins are not just good money. They are the best money. The Bitcoin network has the best monetary policy and the best brand. We should therefore expect that Bitcoins will drive out bad, weak currencies. By what process will Bitcoins become the dominant currency? Which fiat currencies will be the first to disappear? These are the interesting questions of the day, as the necessary premises for these questions are already established truths. And in a footnote, if you disagree, then either you have not been learning or you have not been engaging in the debate. Go back to square one. So I think this, very short section, mostly focused on this quote and just, validating within the context of Bitcoin. Gresham's law is this thing that comes up all the time in monetary economics. And could you explain why Gresham's law is just not actually applicable here?
It's the most misunderstood concept from monetary economics ever. So Gresham's law is really about situations where you have what you might call, for example, bimetallism, right? So if you have gold and silver where the government has established a fixed exchange rate between gold and silver, and in that context, it makes sense to get rid of the overvalued, let's say the silver is overvalued, so you go spend your silver, and the gold is undervalued, so you make sure you never spend it, you hold it, because of artificial intervention from the monetary authorities that have forced a invalid price onto the market for money. And so it only applies in that situation. In any other situation, when somebody says like, oh, I'm going to spend my dollars instead of spending my Bitcoin because I think my Bitcoin are undervalued and my dollars are overvalued, the problem with that is that it does not address the question of fungibility, essentially that you are free to exchange at a floating exchange rate between Bitcoin and dollars. And so you have exactly the same opportunity cost. You could go and acquire more Bitcoin instead of buying your coffee. So there's no reason to say, oh, I'm going to spend my dollars. The only real economic question is, are you going to spend any money at all? And that if you choose between your dollars or your Bitcoin, that really has to do with what are your cash balances at that time, and should you be acquiring more Bitcoin instead? So, because then the argument from the people who are like get on zero is that why do you have any dollars at all? You should have to use Bitcoin because you don't have any dollars. So the reason why in that scenario it makes sense to use dollars instead of Bitcoin it's just pure convenience. It has nothing to do with the monetary economics. It's really about the payment system and the inconvenience of having to spend and replace or something like that. And so I would really encourage folks to read, and this is, Robert Mundell made this point in this, he wrote a whole essay about uses and abuses of Gresham's law, because it's not like this abuse of Gresham's law started with Bitcoin. It's been a recurring misinterpretation of Gresham's law that then essentially it fails to explain why strong currencies succeed. Because if you really strongly hold to Gresham's law, you would say that, okay, well, strong currencies fail because nobody wants to spend them, and so they don't circulate, and then people have to hold weak currencies because that's what's circulating, and so therefore there's really no hope of improving the quality of the coin.
Yeah, and that kind of gets into things that we've talked about a lot on here, which is like, yeah, viewing money because of the circulation between people, or money as being the thing that's being held in the cash balance for the purpose of indirect exchange. And that seems like it plays into the flaws of people's thinking here.
But we're going to learn about the inverse, Thiers' law, which is actually applicable in this scenario.
Yes. And once again, because Bitcoin is free floating against the dollar. And so there's, obviously the government does create barriers. That there's things like capital gains tax, and even things, like money transmitter laws, KYC, et cetera, et cetera. These sort of things create different barriers that at the very least for any particular one of these changes the behavior of the economic actors away from what they would have naturally done had those things not existed. And that's, some of that can kind of be a little bump. Some of it ends up, perhaps in some way helping Bitcoin in the sense of in an unintended way, I should say, with like capital gains tax, where it might actually incentivize many people to just hold on to the Bitcoin for longer rather than spending it because they don't want to deal with the inconvenience of capital gains tax. And yet that holding ends up increasing the marginal value of Bitcoin and helping it along. So, it's an interesting, complex game, but we're going to get more into how Bitcoin's dealing with it. So, 1, fiat bleed. Bitcoin's current trend is to increase in value on an exponential trend line as new users arrive in waves. The good money is, quote, slowly driving out the bad. 2 factors drive this. 1, reduction in information asymmetry. People are learning about Bitcoin and coming to the realization that Bitcoins are indeed the best money. Possible overlapping motives. ADHD, compulsive novelty fetishism induced by our post-war consumer culture and or innate biological processes. FOMO, fear of missing out. See regret theory and in-groups, aka avarice and status seeking. PISD, post-internet stress disorder, aka disruption, next big thing, Internet of Money. 2, increasing liquidity. Buying Bitcoins is more convenient and has fewer fees attached today than a year ago. One can reasonably predict that this will also be the case a year from now. Why? Because selling Bitcoins is a profitable and competitive business. Why? Because people want Bitcoins. See above. Due to group psychology, these newcomers arrive in waves. The waves have a destabilizing effect on the exchange rate. Speculators are unsure of the amplitude or wavelength of adoption, and amateurish punters let their excitement as well as subsequent fear overwhelm them. Regardless, once the tide has pulled back and the weak hands have folded, the price is a few times higher than before the wave. This, quote, slow bleed is the current adoption model, and commentators generally assume one of the following. 1, slow bleed never occurred. It's a fiction based on misleading data. 2, slow bleed has stopped. The above motives only affect libertarians and angry teens. 3, the process will taper off now, as all the super tech savvy people are already getting on board. My own prediction is that slow bleed has been accelerating and is only the first step. The second step will be speculative attacks that use Bitcoins as a platform. The third and final step will be Hyperbitcoinization. So I guess, yeah, can you talk about this slow bleed and, kind of these waves? I guess, we could talk about that in terms of hype cycles.
Yeah. So I think that something that makes Bitcoin pretty unique in terms of, if you think about like technology adoption, broadly speaking. So if you've got iPhones, you don't have this phenomenon of people speculating on iPhones and hoarding iPhones and then trying to like time the iPhone market. And that's just not the case with Bitcoin. So due to the monetary nature of this new technological asset, you have lots of people who are speculating on the price. And furthermore, as adoption increases, you also have a counterflow of disadoption, meaning you have people who are being incentivized by the higher price to sell their Bitcoin to rebalance. And I think that's what explains why it is maybe slower than I would have expected in terms of adoption, is that when you have a bull market, it attracts a lot of sellers who bought in at a lower price. And so then you end up having this oscillation around fundamental value of people crowding in with that herd mentality. And then, of course, once the price goes too high and the leveraged traders are overextended, then you have a crash that actually pushes away adoption because people don't want to buy Bitcoin when it's going down generally. And that this is just the normal ebbs and flows. And so then, I think that the big question has been, at what point is the market saturated? Meaning, at what point do we actually reach some kind of equilibrium of full adoption where there's not a new marginal buyer driving up the price, and so there's no incentive for a new marginal seller to come in, and that Bitcoin would become a stable coin? I think that there's that piece of it, but we'll get into the financial piece of it after.
Great. Well, let's continue on then. So 2 currency crises. I'm quoting Satoshi Nakamoto on January 17th, 2009. It might make sense just to get some in case it catches on. If enough people think the same way, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Once it gets bootstrapped, there are so many applications. If you could effortlessly pay a few cents to a website as easily as dropping coins in a vending machine. End quote. Slow bleed leads to currency crisis as the expected value of Bitcoin solidifies in people's minds. At first, they are conservative. They invest, quote, what they can afford to lose. After 12 to 18 months, their small stash of Bitcoins has dramatically increased in value. They see no reason why this long-term trend should reverse. The fundamentals have improved, and yet adoption remains low. Their confidence increases. They buy more Bitcoins. They rationalize, quote, well, it's only 1 to 5% of my investments, end quote. They see the price crash a few times due to bubbles bursting or just garden variety panic sales. It entices them to buy more. Quote, a bargain. Bitcoin grows on the asset side of their balance sheet. On the liability side of the Bitcoiner's balance sheet, there are mortgages, student loans, car loans, credit cards, etc. Everyone admonishes people to not borrow in order to buy Bitcoins. The reality is that money is fungible. If you buy Bitcoins instead of paying down your mortgage's principal, you are a leveraged Bitcoin investor. Almost everyone is a leveraged Bitcoin investor because it makes economic sense within reason. The cost of borrowing, annualized interest rates ranging from 0 to 25%, is lower than the expected return of owning Bitcoins. How leveraged someone's balance sheet is depends on the ratio between assets and liabilities. The appeal of leveraging up increases if people believe that fiat-denominated liabilities are going to decrease in real terms, i.e., if they expect inflation to be greater than the interest rate they pay. At that point, it becomes a no-brainer to borrow the weak local currency using whatever collateral a bank will accept, invest in a strong foreign currency, and pay back the loan later with realized gains. In this process, banks create more weak currency, amplifying the problem. The effect of people, businesses, or financial institutions borrowing their local currency to buy Bitcoins is that the Bitcoin price in that currency would go up relative to other currencies. To illustrate, let's say that middle-class Indians trickle into Bitcoin. Thousands of buyers turns into hundreds of thousands of buyers. They borrow Indian rupees using whatever unencumbered collateral they have, homes, businesses, gold jewelry, etc. They use these rupees to buy Bitcoins. The price of Bitcoins in Indian rupees goes up. A premium develops relative to other currency pairs. A Bitcoin in India might be worth 600, while in the US it trades at 500. Traders would buy Bitcoins in the US and sell them in India to net a $100 gain. They would then sell their Indian rupees for dollars. This would weaken the Indian rupee, causing import inflation and losses for foreign investors. The Indian central bank would have to either increase interest rates to break the cycle, impose capital controls, or spend their foreign currency reserves trying to prop up the rupee's exchange rate. Only raising interest rates would be a sustainable solution, though it would throw the country into a recession. There's a huge problem with the Indian central bank raising interest rates. Bitcoin's historical returns is 500% per year. Obviously, that's gone down a little bit since. Even if investors' expected future return is 1/10 of that, i.e. today, the central bank would have to increase interest rates to unconscionable levels to break the attack. The result is evident. Everyone would flee the rupee and adopt Bitcoins due to economic duress rather than technological enlightenment. This example is purely illustrative, but it could happen in a small country at first, or it could happen simultaneously around the world. Who leverages their balance sheet and how is impossible to predict, and it will be impossible to stop when the dam cracks. Which countries are most vulnerable to a currency crisis? Business Insider provides a helpful list here. Bitcoins will have to reach a certain threshold of liquidity, indicated by a solid exchange in every financial center and a real money supply, i.e. market cap, of at least $50 billion, before they can be used as an instrument in a speculative attack. This will either coincide with or cause a currency crisis. Yeah, I mean, I guess you kind of answered my question that I was going to have for you, which was, we sort of, I think, imagined that Bitcoin would kind of engage in these speculative attacks in smaller countries first and then work their way up, the chain of bigger currencies. The Business Insider list it's like a list of countries most vulnerable to crisis. But in many ways, it's like, well, which countries have the weakest currencies? Yet today, I think the sort of biggest speculative attacks that are happening are in the dollar world. But you answered that because you say that, ultimately it's impossible to predict because, it is a global economy, this Bitcoin economy. And so anyone, anywhere might have the right balance sheet, and look at their assets and liabilities and see an opportunity. And so, yeah, could you talk more about how that actually played out?
Well, it's funny to me that I put such a low number on it of $50 billion market cap. At the time, that was a fanciful idea. That was like, wow, that's big money. Today, that's just like Saylor's balance sheet. He's got $50 billion of Bitcoin. So, now the market cap's at $2 trillion. And so it definitely, I think, required a bigger market cap than I had assumed. And then there's also the question of like, how long does this speculative attack take? And this is something I've been grappling with myself. I don't know. So there's a point of humility there. I know that it's happening. I don't know how long it's going to take. And that, I think that we're in it now. And that the big challenge, of course, will be on the regulatory side. That is that you'll have governments that start to recognize what's happening and that will try to find ways to implement capital controls to slow it down or raise interest rates, or hopefully what I think would be the most productive way to go about in protecting from this would be to acquire a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And that's what that IMF paper recommended. And that's what the IMF should be doing. It's crazy to me that today the IMF is giving a hard time to the only country in the world that actually is promoting financial monetary stability by acquiring Bitcoin for its reserves, which is El Salvador. It's literally like every other country in the world is being very irresponsible and making themselves vulnerable to Bitcoin speculative attacks, except for El Salvador. And the IMF is out there giving them a hard time and saying, oh, no, you should, not acquire so many Bitcoin, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the IMF needs a top-down reform, if not absolute abolition, because what the IMF should be doing, if there's going to be an IMF at all, is that they should be helping countries implement strategic Bitcoin reserves and helping countries find ways to accumulate Bitcoin that is not, harming their citizens or anything like that. So that's the world we live in today.
Yeah, you'd think in a sane world that they would want to be giving out loans to countries that have more creditworthiness rather than less, and Bitcoin being such collateral should be raising the creditworthiness, and like you say, these the monetary stability in relation to kind of all the international currency stuff going on, because Bitcoin has number go up. Just as a reference, I believe the market cap at the time of this article was roughly 5 billion, give or take. Might have been a little higher. So in some sense, what you were saying was it would need to grow 10x in order for us to probably start seeing this. You were seeing this in the future. That being said, while it doesn't necessarily constitute full blown speculative attack, as you say, the actual principles driving a speculative attack are rather simple. It's just recognizing that there is a higher return on Bitcoin than the costs of a loan in a weaker currency. And with that in mind, I remember even back then there were people maxing out credit cards so that they could buy a lot of Bitcoin. There are people
are still doing that, by the way. I advise against it because I think that you can end up in trouble and being a forced seller of Bitcoin. But by all accounts, there has been a retail-driven speculative attack on the dollar or fiat currencies from Bitcoin maxis doing exactly that for the past however many years, 15 years.
Yes. Yeah. And this, we've seen it with student loans. We've seen it with mortgages. We've seen all sorts of things that just sort of, normal people have access to. And I think getting to that market cap was a matter of opening up more and more. And I think it did take longer for this, obviously. Like it was a bit longer before we saw things like good, even just margin loans for Bitcoin. But these are things, it was like all the different things that just like individuals, retail did have access to. There were people out there making use of it. And what we're seeing now, it's that just at a bigger level. But at the same time, funny thing is that if those people who were doing speculative attacks in their own personal way back then, as risky as it was, and as much as even we kind of wins, because it's you can put yourself in a real bind, and I for one am not really interested in debt. I like Bitcoin because you don't have a debt-driven economy. But those people, while it seems so modest, those people were also buying, I think, when you kind of think of the economic proportions of what they were doing, it was in some ways, I guess you would have to run the numbers. Maybe you have a better intuition of this, but it's almost like at the time, sort of like, MicroStrategy moves. If you think of how big MicroStrategy is and, they bought 1,000 Bitcoins, when you compare the amount of newly acquired Bitcoin to the size of the company, I do think that those sort of early speculative attackers were, in some sense, more successful at increasing their share of the Bitcoin economy.
Yeah, I agree.
So continuing on, number three. So first was the fiat bleed, and then we have the currency crises, and now 3, hyperbitcoinization. A speculative attack that seems isolated to one or a few weak currencies, but causes the purchasing power of Bitcoins to go up dramatically, will rapidly turn into a contagion. For example, the Swiss will see the price of Bitcoins go up tenfold and then 100-fold. At the margin, they will buy Bitcoin simply because they want to speculate on their value, not due to an inherent problem with the Swiss franc. The reflexivity here entails that the reduction in demand for Swiss francs would actually cause higher than expected inflation and thus an inherent problem with the Swiss franc. The feedback loop between fiat inflation and Bitcoin deflation will throw the world into full hyper-Bitcoinization, explained by Daniel here. And we'll be getting to that article in a few more episodes. But I think what's interesting here is because Bitcoin is so limited, not even very historically strong currencies like the Swiss franc have a sort of inherent defense against it. Other than, like you were saying, acquiring Bitcoin and, sort of backing the Swiss franc with Bitcoin to sort of aid against it.
Yeah, that's right. And it puts them in a no-win situation because once they start acquiring for the strategic reserve, then, they're admitting defeat, essentially.
Yeah, so I guess when it comes to hyperbitcoinization, we'll get to that at the future thing. I think this article is more about those steps leading up to that final point, but also pointing out that this is how it gets to that point. So I'll go ahead and read conclusion. Bitcoin will become mainstream. The Bitcoin skeptics don't understand this due to their biases and lack of financial knowledge. First, they are in as strong an echo chamber as Bitcoin skeptics. In a footnote, you have a quote from Pauline Kael.
Yeah.
Quote, I live in a rather special world. I only know one person who voted for Nixon. Where they are, I don't know. They are outside my ken. But sometimes when I'm in a theater, I can feel them.
So that was I think she was like a New York journalist who was so in her echo chamber that when Nixon won the election, she was surprised because she didn't know anyone who voted for him.
Yeah. And, if I assume that may have been also either I guess it would have been either 1968 or 1972, but that 1972 one was such an absolute landslide. So it's almost kind of funny when you don't know anyone who's voted. And I think we've seen that in recent American politics too, like more recent presidential elections.
And now with Bitcoin, you hear it in the form of, I don't know anyone who uses Bitcoin who's not a criminal. It's like, oh, okay. So you're in a really
don't talk
tight
to
echo
anyone.
chamber.
Because meanwhile, it's like everyone I know is into Bitcoin, which it is our own, everyone has their echo chambers, but
choose your echo chamber.
What was that?
You have to choose your echo chamber. That's the art of the deal. And people think, oh, I'm not in an echo chamber. I really very rarely meet people who are able to live both in normie land and in Bitcoin land, but I admire them.
There's the classic, thing about how you're the average of the five people you spend the most time with. So, that's your echo chamber, those 5 people. And choose them well. Try to get most of them Bitcoiners and most of them people who want to improve their lives and do good things rather than be mad online at people who are are making a good change in the world. So they rapidly search for evidence that confirms their view of Bitcoin. Second, they misunderstand how strong currencies like Bitcoin overtake weak currencies like the dollar. It is through speculative attacks and currency crises caused by investors, not through the careful evaluation of tech journalists and, quote, mainstream consumers. To honor these soon-to-be extinct skeptics, the Nakamoto Institute has launched a tribute to bold assertions. And that was, it's still up there. There's the skeptics page that people can visit on the Nakamoto Institute website. I feel like there's a lot of updates that need to be made to it. And if people have suggestions of people who are notable, it shouldn't just be, random people, because first of all, there's way too many of them, but also it's just they're not as sort of relevant to this broad discourse. But on there, we have, Nobel Prize winning economists and best-selling authors and notable businessmen and so on and so forth. And just tracking their bold claim that Bitcoin would die or go to zero or whatever it may be. And
well, we're in a really unique and new world now where, so I think the biggest quote unquote skeptics today would be Jamie Dimon and Jim Chanos. And Jamie Dimon, even though he personally is probably still skeptical, he's said things like, well, maybe it makes sense if you're in a country where like the local currency is terrible, which to me is, okay, you've just admitted the point. And his bank, JP Morgan, is heavily involved in Bitcoin-related activities. The second, Jim Chanos.
Can I just jump in on that one too? That itself is notable because JP Morgan has long been on the blockchain, not Bitcoin side of things. So the fact that we're starting to see them talking about doing access to Bitcoin ETFs and using Bitcoin ETFs as collateral and so on and so forth is a huge shift. And for the people's money that they've been holding in a JP Morgan Chase account, the price of groceries sure have gone up in a way that actually does make Bitcoin very attractive.
Yeah, agree. So with Jim Chanos, his thesis, and this isn't even like, I hesitate to even call this anti-Bitcoin because it's so weak, is that Bitcoin's not going to grow as quickly as its proponents think it will. And so we've gone from Bitcoin is going to go to zero to Bitcoin's growth rate is going to be less than 50% per year, which is, okay, well, you're really splitting hairs here, Mr. Chanos, and that I think, outside of that, you'd be hard to find a serious person who still thinks Bitcoin's going to go to zero.
Right. I think that's a very good point, and I agree. I mean, there really there doesn't seem to be much of a real assault on Bitcoin in any serious way anymore. And now it seems like more of the battle is just the raw education of helping people come to understand what this thing is that's happening. When he says that it's not going to be going up 50%, does he have like his target and why?
No, not to my knowledge, at least, because basically the way he's expressing this view is by going long Bitcoin and shorting MicroStrategy. And Strategy's whole premise is that if Bitcoin does really well over the long term, that because they're leveraged, their equity will outperform Bitcoin. And Jim's taking the other side of that trade.
Yeah, it's just interesting because, even I like Saylor's kind of view of the S&P 500 as sort of an indicator of the kind of the real economy, like what the inflation rate is and such, because equities are this major thing that people, put their money into because they can't just hold cash. And S&P goes up by about 10%. So Bitcoin could slow down a lot and still be outperforming the S&P 500, which is already a sort of indicator to people like us of the devaluation and sort of debasement of the dollar over time. So it's just like going 50%. Yes, it would be awesome for Bitcoin to continue being 50%. But even like Michael Saylor, thinks that'll slow down over time. It's not like, we believe it's going to be 50% forever. It was certainly not 500% forever.
It's up for debate.
Technically speaking, it is, because we don't know, like we discussed, I think it was either last week or the week before, when you are now on such a sound money, it's very possible that the costs of capital and consumer goods and everything, you have so much productivity that, I don't know, maybe there is some sci-fi scenario where we do start increasing at that rate. It's really not something that we can predict ahead of time of what the quote GDP. I hate to use that the even make reference to it, but like sort of the economic growth of the Bitcoin economy. It's hard to know ahead of time what a Bitcoin economy would grow at. So that it is important to be open-minded to even fanciful numbers.
I agree.
So with that in mind, so that's the article. This one, to me, the only thing that really stands out is maybe a little more, kind of where there might be nits. One, 50 billion. It obviously took a bit longer for speculative attacks to be really put into play. And also, I think it's interesting that it ended up being more in the dollar economy than it was, as far as we know, in the rupee economy. The rupees, continue going. I feel like so. I think there's probably also like reasons in hindsight for that, which is that, there's just way more capital markets here and a lot of money that wants to find its way into stuff.
Also, as far as I know, India has been very restrictive on Bitcoin adoption. So there's been controls there.
Yes, that's a good point. So the United States, and we'll be discussing this in some future episodes, the question of government bans. The government, as much as people fear would shut down Bitcoin, whether they intended or not, they left the door open for Bitcoin in so many ways, especially the ways that were most heavily conducive for serious Bitcoin economic growths. Had they said you're not allowed to save Bitcoin, but you are allowed to spend it, rather than some attempts at the opposite, we would have seen a very different trajectory for Bitcoin within the United States. But they chose to make it a very, very open. Bitcoin ownership has been a very open thing forever. There's obviously there are onerous regulations with, like we said, KYC, with capital gains tax, et cetera. But these things were not, those were not enough to stop wanting to save in Bitcoin. So, yeah, the United States ended up having a lot going for it for this purpose. So I think in hindsight, it's almost not surprising, but it's always 2020. And I think it's important. I think you were right at the time to point out that it was impossible to know sort of when or how this would actually get going. But now we're in 2025, and it really does feel going. And next week, I think we're going to, rather than continuing the mempool, we're going to make a small injection with Speculative Attack Season 2, which was written, I believe, last year, as a follow-up to this article. So I think it's noteworthy enough to hop into that and discuss the ramifications of this particular article, Speculative Attack, in the current day, and more about how it's specifically playing out.
Yeah, I think that on the dollar part, we have to keep in mind that the U.S. dollar is the final boss and is also the most liquid pair with Bitcoin. And so it must, in hindsight, was inevitable that it would mostly be focused on the dollar.
And, you could tell me whether or not you want to answer this question now or after next week. Yeah. But do you think that means hyperbitcoinization will come faster than you would have thought previously?
Oh, I feel like I've given up on that game. That now I'm like, I don't know. Well, on one hand, it's like, oh, I don't know how long it'll take, and then on the other hand, it's like it already happened, and it's continuing to happen.
Yes, and inside Bitcoiners, there are two wolves, and it's all about finding that zen between the wolves and just living your day-to-day life with recognition that this stuff is going on.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Pierre. Thank you for writing this article. I think it's, like I said, I mean, it's had such an outsized impact, I think, on people's perception of Bitcoin and, over the years. And like I said, I think this is among one of the most important articles that we have on the website. And I suggest people, come back and reread it and think about its implications and, share it with friends as well.
Yep.
All right.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you for listening to The Reorg. This podcast is brought to you by the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute, dedicated to advancing and preserving Bitcoin knowledge. Our mission is to deepen understanding and appreciation of Bitcoin, not just for today, but for generations to come, by creating enduring educational resources and generational knowledge for generational wealth. If you enjoyed the show, please support our work by sharing links, deepening your own Bitcoin knowledge by exploring and studying the SNI archives, and contributing sats. As a 501c3 nonprofit, we rely entirely on supporters like you. Whether you can give a few Satoshis or a few thousand Bitcoins, your contributions enable us to continue educating current and future Bitcoiners worldwide.